From the mists of time, a name rises, Henry VIII. Not just a king, but an ambitious, passionate, and unpredictable ruler. His reign wasn't written on the battlefield, but in the whispers that echoed through the stone walls of his palace. For power, for love, even for an heir. 6 women shaped the fate of a man and the history of an empire. Can you hear the footsteps echoing through the cold stone corridors in the shadow of Tudor England? Maybe it's the sorrow of one queen, the triumph of another, or the fear of yet another. Each of Henry VIII's wives was like a pawn in the deadly chess game for the throne. Some were loved, some betrayed, and some gave their necks to the executioner. But all of them left indelible marks on the history of England. Today, I invite you to dive into this tale where power and passion intertwine. Get ready to discover how a king's desires shaped a dynasty, how court intrigues cost lives, and how history was rewritten. Listen closely, because history only lives when it's told. Ah, Henry VIII. Everyone knows him for his strong will and turbulent marriages, but to truly understand him, we need to go back to his youth. As a young prince, do you think he had any idea how heavy his destiny would be? Let's take a look together at his early years and the first major journey he took as a king. It's 1509. Henry, the second king of the Tudor dynasty in England, ascended the throne at just 17 years old. What a huge responsibility. He had to please the people, the nobility, and the church. But one of a king's most important duties was to secure the dynasty's future. England's fate was tied to having an heir. Young Henry saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a warrior, a scholar, and even a poet. Unlike his father, Henry VII, with his strict financial policies, the young king's heart leaned toward grandeur, glory, and display. He wanted to be a powerful ruler, but creating a powerful dynasty was just as important. Because the Tudor dynasty was still fragile, it had risen out of civil wars and power struggles, and without a solid heir, the throne could easily be in jeopardy. That's why marriage for the young king wasn't just a personal matter, it was a state affair. Choosing the right wife wasn't just about love, it was a political move, and fate had already brought Henry to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. But could Catherine give the Tudor dynasty the strong male heir Henry needed? Could she build the solid, unshakable legacy Henry was looking for? This is where one of history's biggest turning points happens, and the starting point of Henry's years of turbulent marital adventures. My young friend, today I'm going to tell you about one of the biggest turning points in English history. This isn't just about a king's love life. It's a chain of events that changed the fate of an entire nation. Henry VIII, the mighty king who made history with 6 marriages. But at the very beginning, there was just one woman, Catherine of Aragon. The year was 1509. Young Henry took the throne of England at just 17 years old. He was strong, handsome, and full of energy. But let's not forget, he wasn't just any king, he was a Tudor. And the Tudors were determined to build their dynasty on solid ground. That's why Henry stepped into a marriage that was more than just personal, it was political. Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, had originally been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. But when Arthur died young, everything changed. England and Spain needed to maintain their alliance, and so Catherine married Henry with a special dispensation from the Pope to make it official. This marriage wasn't just about love, it was about securing England's position in Europe. At first, Catherine seemed like the perfect queen. She was intelligent, well-educated, and of noble blood. She had the respect of Henry's advisors and the people of England. But to Henry, a queen had one primary duty, to give him an heir. And that's where things started to fall apart. In the early years of their marriage, Catherine became pregnant multiple times. But tragedy struck again and again. Either the pregnancies ended in miscarriage, or the children didn't survive long after birth. The only exception was Mary, Tudor, born in 1516. But she was a girl, and in Henry's eyes that meant the Tudor line still had no strong male heir. Henry's patience began to wear thin. He saw himself as God's chosen ruler of England, and he started to believe that his inability to have a surviving son was a divine punishment. Maybe, he thought, marrying his brother's widow had been a sin in the eyes of God. Maybe that was why he was being denied a son. But let's be honest, that was just an excuse. The real reason Henry wanted out of his marriage? Another woman. Anne Boleyn, clever, ambitious, and completely unlike any other woman in Henry's court. She wasn't someone who would just fall at his feet. She had her own terms, her own demands. From the moment Henry saw her, he was obsessed. And Anne told him one thing: she would never be his mistress. She would only be his queen. Those words drove Henry mad. He had to divorce Catherine. He had to marry Anne. But there was one huge obstacle standing in his way: the Pope. Getting a divorce wasn't easy. Henry begged the Pope to annul his marriage, to declare it invalid. But in the Catholic world, divorce wasn't something that could just happen. And to make things worse, Catherine wasn't just anyone. She was the aunt of the powerful King of Spain. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. That was it. Henry had had enough. If the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted, he'd take matters into his own hands. And in doing so, he changed England forever. Since he couldn't get permission to divorce, Henry came up with a radical solution. He broke away from the Catholic Church. In 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy, creating the Church of England and declaring himself its supreme leader. The Pope no longer had power in England, Henry did. This wasn't just about his love life. It reshaped the entire country. England severed ties with the Catholic world. Church lands and wealth were seized by the crown, and Catholics found themselves persecuted. What had started as Henry's quest for a male heir had sparked one of the biggest religious and political revolutions in history. But the story doesn't end there. Catherine lost her crown and her status, but Henry's chaotic love life was only just beginning, because Anne Boleyn's time on the throne wouldn't bring him peace for long. But it's a story for another time. For now, let's take a breath. My young friend, today I'm going to tell you the story of one of history's most passionate and tragic women. A woman who ran after a king, changed the fate of a nation, and ultimately had her head chopped off, etching her name in history. Anne Boleyn's story is like a tale woven with desire, power, and betrayal. But remember, in royal palaces, fairy tales don't always have happy endings. Anne Boleyn. There was something about her that set her apart from other women. She wasn't famous for her beauty, and she didn't come from a noble family, but her intelligence, charm, and sharp tongue had completely captivated Henry. She was raised in France, where she learned grace and intrigue. She refused to be just a mistress. To her, she was either going to be queen or nothing at all. Henry was in love with Anne. He wanted to marry her, to have a male heir with her, but there was a major obstacle standing in his way: Queen Catherine. And we know, when Henry set his eyes on something, he was willing to do anything to get it. Henry asked the Pope for a divorce from Catherine, but the Church refused. So Henry found another solution. He created his own church. He declared the Church of England, made himself its head, and declared his marriage to Catherine invalid. In 1533, Anne Boleyn became the new Queen of England. But the real victory was growing inside Anne's belly: the future Queen, Elizabeth. In 1533, Anne gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Elizabeth. But in Henry's eyes there was no joy, only disappointment. He had wanted a male heir. God had given him a daughter. This was Anne's first major blow. Without a son, the throne couldn't stay secure. Anne became pregnant several more times, but each pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Henry's patience was running out. He had left Catherine because she couldn't give him a male heir. Now the same fate threatened Anne, and Henry's eyes had already turned to someone else. Anne had used her intelligence and charm to become queen, but she had many enemies. Henry's chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, thought Anne had become a threat. A queen who had fallen out of favor with the king was now just a burden. And then the intrigues began. Whispers spread through the palace. Anne was cheating on her husband, not with just one man, but with several. Worse yet, rumors circulated that she had an inappropriate relationship with her own brother, George Boleyn. She wasn't just accused of adultery, she was also accused of witchcraft. Henry's love for her had turned into rage. Anne was arrested, tried, and found guilty. When she stood in front of that court, she was still proud, her head held high, but she knew how justice worked in the Tudor court. The decision was clear: death. May 19, 1536. At the Tower of London, Anne was led to the scaffold. She walked to her death in silence. The executioner brought in for her was specially sent from France. His sword would sever her head in a single blow. Her last words were calm and obedient. She never rebelled against Henry, always referring to him as a great king. People watched in horror. Once England's most powerful woman, Anne Boleyn was now just a body with no head. Did her death create a hole in Henry's heart? Or was this just a new beginning for him? See, Henry's love and hate were as sharp as the stroke of a sword. But young friend, this was only the beginning. Henry's journey wasn't over. There was a third queen on the way, and things were going to get even more complicated. But that's another story, and to tell it, we need to take a breath first. My young friend, today I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most passionate yet tragic women in history. A woman who chased a king, changed the fate of a nation, and ended up losing her head, becoming a part of history. The story of Anne Boleyn is like a fairy tale, woven with ambition, power, and betrayal. But remember, in royal palaces, fairy tales don't always have a happy ending. Anne Boleyn, there was something about her that set her apart from other women. She wasn't famous for her beauty, nor did she come from an aristocratic family, but her intelligence, charm, and sharp tongue had completely captivated Henry. She had grown up in France, where she learned elegance and intrigue. She refused to be just a mistress. For her, it was either queen or nothing. Henry was in love with Anne. He wanted to marry her and have a male heir with her, but there was a big obstacle: Queen Catherine. And we know, once Henry set his eyes on something, he'd do anything to get it. Henry petitioned the Pope for a divorce from Catherine, but the Church rejected his request. Henry found a solution in creating his own church. He declared the Church of England, made himself its head, and annulled his marriage to Catherine. In 1533, Anne Boleyn became England's new queen. But the real victory was growing in Anne's womb. The future Queen Elizabeth. In 1533, Anne gave birth to a girl. They named her Elizabeth. But instead of joy, there was disappointment in Henry's eyes. He had wanted a male heir. God had given him a girl. This was Anne's first major blow. Without a male heir, the throne couldn't remain secure. Anne had a few more pregnancies, but each time it ended in a miscarriage. Henry's patience was running thin. He had already discarded Catherine for failing to produce a male heir. Now the same fate threatened Anne, and Henry's eyes had already turned to someone else. Anne used her intelligence and charm to become queen, but she also had many enemies. Henry's chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, believed Anne had become a threat. A queen who had fallen out of favor with the king was now just a burden. And that's when the intrigue started. Whispers began to spread in the palace. Anne was betraying her husband, not with just one man, but with several. Worse still, rumors spread that she was having an inappropriate relationship with her own brother, George Boleyn. She wasn't just accused of adultery, she was also accused of witchcraft. Henry's love for her had now turned to anger. She was arrested, tried, and found guilty. When she went to trial, she still held her head high. But she knew how justice worked in the Tudor court. The verdict was clear: death. On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to the execution block at the Tower of London. She walked silently to her death. The executioner brought in from France would strike her head off with one blow. Her last words were calm and obedient. She never rebelled against Henry, always referring to him as a great king. And the sword swung. People watched in horror. Once England's most powerful woman, Anne Boleyn, was now just a body without a head. Did her death leave a hole in Henry's heart? Or was it just a new beginning for him? Henry's love and hatred were as sharp as a sword. But my young friend, this was just the beginning. Henry's adventures were far from over. There was a third queen in the picture, and things were about to get even more complicated. But that's another story. And to tell it, we need to take a little breather. Ah, my young friend, history has its twists. Sometimes it's a war, sometimes it's a love, and sometimes it's a painting that determines the fate of nations. Now, the story I'm about to tell you is one of those pivotal moments in history. King Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, a queen who neither lusted for the throne nor walked to the execution block, but still, her name is etched in Tudor history. It was a time when Henry's life was full of storms. After the death of Jane Seymour, Henry sought a new wife for the political future of England. Religious wars were raging in Europe, Catholics and Protestants were at odds, and England needed new allies. At this point, the king's chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, stepped in. To secure a Protestant ally, he suggested a marriage to a princess from the Duchy of Cleves. The most suitable choice was Anne of Cleves. As a daughter of a German prince, Anne was seen as a wife who could align with England's new religious direction. But Henry couldn't go to Cleves. Since he couldn't meet the princess in person, a portrait was painted for him. The renowned artist Hans Holbein created the painting, and it was enough to catch Henry's interest. The woman appeared noble and elegant. The marriage was arranged, envoys came from Cleves, and agreements were made. Henry was now looking forward to meeting his new queen, but here fate's strange twist took over. In January 1540, Anne arrived in England. However, the moment Henry laid eyes on her, he was disappointed. While Holbein's portrait had been meticulous and grand, to Henry, Anne seemed ordinary. It is said that when he first saw her, he whispered to his men, "They've deceived me." For Henry, this marriage was a political necessity, but his desire for the woman was also important. During their first encounters, Anne's shy and reserved demeanor caused Henry to lose interest. He noticed she didn't speak like the elegant ladies of the court, didn't dance, and struggled to speak English. The marriage was inevitable. On January 6, 1540, the wedding took place at Westminster Abbey. However, on the wedding night, Henry didn't touch Anne. Court gossip claimed that the next morning Henry turned to his advisors and said, "I must have been mistaken about the queen. I'm sure she's still a virgin," implying that this marriage wasn't going to work. Just 6 months later, Henry petitioned the church to annul the marriage. The reason given was that Anne had been previously engaged, making the marriage legally invalid. Anne didn't resist much and accepted the decision. In fact, fate had granted her a grace that many Tudor women never experienced. Henry admired how Anne silently accepted the divorce. He didn't humiliate her, didn't imprison her, and didn't have her executed. On the contrary, he gave her the title, the King's Sister, and bestowed upon her vast estates and riches. Properties like Richmond Palace and Hever Castle came under her control. Now, Anne could live a comfortable life, far from court intrigues. Unlike his other wives who faced tragic ends, Anne lived a peaceful and dignified life until Henry's death. She even witnessed the downfall of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, and the rise of his sixth wife, Catherine Parr. She steered clear of the scandals and betrayals at the Tudor court. In 1557, Anne quietly passed away. She was buried in Westminster Abbey. Though she wasn't remembered as a queen, she became one of the Tudor wives who played history the smartest. She wasn't swept away by love, nor did she walk to the execution block out of a lust for the throne. What began with just a portrait turned her into one of the most intriguing characters in history. But my young friend, this was just one story, and Henry's journey was far from over. Ah, my young friend, queens rise and fall. Some remain on the throne for many years, while others pay the price of a single moment's negligence with their lives. Today I will tell you one of the most tragic stories from the Tudor court. It is the story of how innocence and youth were ground down in the web of court intrigues. This is the story of Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard, delicate as a flower, vibrant as a melody, a dazzling young woman. She was a member of the Howard family, of noble birth, but after the death of Jane Seymour, no one could have predicted that Henry's eyes would turn to her. Catherine's life at court began after the marriage to Anne of Cleves. With her youthful and cheerful demeanor, she quickly attracted attention. Henry, now an old man, exhausted by illness, found in Catherine the youth and vibrancy he had lost. Catherine reminded him of the spring breezes, fresh and full of life. The king was mesmerized by Catherine. He thought he had found the passion he had lost after Jane Seymour's death in this young woman. Catherine was only 17 when she became queen, while Henry was approaching 50. But this marriage was not built on love, it was built on desire. And like everything consumed by passion, it would one day turn to ash. The court was a cauldron of gossip, every whisper a dagger. Catherine's past became one of those daggers. Rumors began to spread that the young queen had relationships with other men before her marriage to Henry. Moreover, it was claimed that while married to Henry, she had secret meetings with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper. These were not mere rumors. In the Tudor court, the fate of a queen accused of treason was sealed. Did Catherine betray her husband, or was she merely the victim of her enemies' plots? That, my young friend, was the real question. But for a king like Henry, the answer was simple. Treason could not go unpunished. The queen's chambers were searched, her servants were interrogated. Eventually, her correspondence with Thomas Culpeper was discovered. Henry was driven to madness with rage. He was an old, sick man now. Perhaps he had been captivated by Catherine's youth, but he was not one to forgive betrayal. On a cold February morning in 1542, Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower of London. When she stood before the executioner's block, despite her youth, she had accepted her fate. With a trembling voice, she turned to the executioner and said only one thing. "I don't want to die." But there was no mercy in Tudor courts. The axe fell, and Catherine Howard left this life in the spring of her years. Had Henry's fury subsided? No. For him, this was a matter of pride. But Catherine's death brought a chill to the court. The tragedy of the young queen went down in history as one of the greatest cautionary tales of the Tudor era. Ah, my young friend, history teaches us how dangerous power and authority can be. The tragedy of Catherine Howard is one of its bitterest examples. Queens may wear crowns, but sometimes that crown grows heavy in the shadow of the executioner's block. Now I have another story to tell you, but we must pause for a moment, for the next queen's tale will be very different. Ah, my young friend, this story is not one of a burning love affair fueled by youthful passion, nor of a queen meeting a tragic end due to her desires. No, this is a tale of the triumph of common sense, intelligence, and patience. This is the story of Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife. Surviving in the stormy Tudor court was an art, and Catherine Parr was one of the queens who mastered that art more than any other. But remember, she was not just a queen. She was also a nurse, a diplomat, an intellectual, and perhaps the only woman who truly brought peace to Henry's life. Catherine Parr was no ordinary woman. She came from a noble family, but unlike young, innocent girls like Jane Seymour or Catherine Howard, she was not inexperienced. By the time she married Henry, she had already been widowed twice. She knew love, passion, and loss, but she also understood the importance of survival, strategy, and making the right moves at the right time. Her first marriage was at a young age to Sir Edward Burr, but he died early, leaving her a young widow. Her second marriage was to John Neville, Lord Latimer, an older, wealthy man. This marriage brought her not only land and property, but also political insight and diplomatic skills. During those years, England was embroiled in religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, and Catherine had to deal with her husband's Protestant enemies. When Lord Latimer died, Catherine was once again a widow, but little did she know that her fate was about to change. For now she had become a strong, wise woman, capable of catching the attention of Henry. But the intriguing part of this story is that Catherine's heart was not with Henry, it was with another man, Thomas Seymour, a dangerous and ambitious man in the Tudor court. However, in a world where survival was more important than love, Catherine listened to her mind, not her heart, and found herself as Henry's wife. Henry, once the most powerful and glorious king in England, but those days were behind him. When Catherine married him in 1543, Henry was an old, grouchy man battling illness. His obesity had reached such a level that his leg wounds were constantly infected, and his pain was unbearable. He could no longer walk, and the servants had to carry him around the palace. In this situation, Catherine Parr became more than just a wife. She was a nurse, a counselor, and a refuge for Henry. She patiently endured his mood swings, his rages, and his aggressive outbursts caused by his suffering. But she never bent. She was Catherine Parr, one who had survived court intrigues, 2 marriages, and learned how to live. Catherine did not just show Henry compassion, she also became his advisor. She was consulted on important decisions regarding the future of England, and Catherine became a mother figure to Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. She found a special place in all their hearts. But Catherine's greatest test at court would not come from Henry's illness, but from the religious conflicts that ran through the Tudor court. Catherine Parr was not just a wife or a nurse. She was a deep thinker, an intellectual, and more importantly, she was sympathetic to the Reformation movement. Henry had broken England from the Catholic Church, but he remained a conservative believer. Catherine, however, was sympathetic to Protestant ideas and even wrote Reformation-influenced works. This caused enemies to rise within the court. Especially Catholic advisors began to see Catherine as a threat. They tried to accuse her of heresy, whispering poisonous lies into Henry's ear. At one point, rumors spread that Catherine, like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, would face execution. But Catherine used her intellect to escape this danger. She managed to convince Henry, explaining that her writings were merely for debate and intellectual exercise, and that her true intention was to serve him in matters of religion. Henry forgave her, and thus Catherine became one of the rare queens who survived execution in the Tudor court. When Henry died in 1547, Catherine Parr was once again a widow, but this time she was free. She immediately married Thomas Seymour, the man she had long loved. However, the curse of the Tudors would not leave her alone. Catherine Parr lived to become one of the longest surviving queens in Tudor history. But her story did not end there. The future queen who would shape England, Elizabeth I, grew up under Catherine's care. Perhaps young Elizabeth learned from Catherine Parr the very lessons of how to be a ruler. My young friend, the fate of the Tudor women was never an easy one. Some fell victim to betrayal, some died for love, but Catherine Parr stood apart from them all with her intelligence and patience, and perhaps most importantly, she was the only queen who managed to survive by Henry's side. But the story of the Tudors does not end here. I have much more to tell you, but first, we must pause for a moment. Ah, my friend, it's hard to talk about the final days of a powerful ruler, especially someone like Henry VIII. This king, who once shook Europe with his power, was nothing but a shadow of himself by the end of his life. His final years were a battle filled with illness and regret for a man who had once ridden into battle and ruled his kingdom with an iron fist. And in the end, it all ended with the sound of a death notice echoing through the stone halls of the Tudor palace. Describing Henry's last years is like explaining how a lion's roar turns into a whisper. He was once an athletic, strong man, a king who used to wield a spear in tournaments and dance in his palace. But time doesn't show mercy to anyone, especially not to someone who lived a life of luxury and excess. Over the years, he gained weight and the wounds on his legs wouldn't heal. His obesity became so severe that he could barely walk in his room. His legs were gangrenous, filled with infection. His body, rotting from the inside, spread an unbearable stench to everyone around him. His breath was heavy and his face pale. But maybe the worst part was that his mind, like his body, was also deteriorating. The cheerful, lively king was gone, replaced by a grumpy, paranoid man. He suspected even his closest friends of betrayal and looked at his advisors with distrust. At night, he wrestled with insomnia and fought ghosts of the wives and friends he had sent to the executioner's block, especially Anne Boleyn's ghost, who sometimes seemed to walk through his room. Ah, poor Henry. Power had once lifted him to the top, but now that very power was slowly eating him alive. January 13th, 547. The king was now on his deathbed. His eyes were sunken, his voice weak. Doctors, advisors, and priests whispered around him. He knew his end was near. But Henry, true to form, wanted to control his fate until the very end. He tried to appear strong until his last breath, but his body was betraying him. In his final moments, Catherine Parr was by his side. She held his hand, trying to comfort him in his last days. But Henry had committed too many sins to die in peace. Before he passed, he had his will written. He declared his son Edward VI as his heir. But he knew Edward was still just a child and the country needed someone to guide it. So he ordered a council to be formed. They would rule the country until Edward came of age. And then, on January 28, 1547, Henry VIII took his final breath. The most powerful king of the Tudor dynasty quietly passed away in his massive bed. But his legacy would live on, even after his death. The wives, children, and decisions he left behind would continue to shape England. But what about his wives? Henry was gone, but the stories didn't end here. Out of Henry VIII's 6 wives, only one was able to give him a male heir, Jane Seymour. Her son, little Edward VI, took the throne. But sadly, he wouldn't be the strong king his father had hoped for. Edward became king at just 9 years old, but he was sickly. He wasn't big and strong like his father, he was frail, delicate. The kingdom was ruled by his advisors. Edward wanted to push the Protestant Reformation even further, but he didn't have enough time. Before he even reached 15, he fell ill and died. Henry's big dream of continuing the Tudor dynasty with a strong male heir. But fate had other plans. And what about Anne of Cleves, who became known as the king's sister? She was one of the ones who welcomed Henry's death the most because she was free now. Thanks to the wealth and high status Henry had given her, she lived a happy life in England. She never remarried, but kept her ties to the court. She was one of the luckiest of the Tudor queens. She was never accused of treason or sent to the executioner. She lived a long, peaceful life and passed away in 1557 from natural causes. Ah, Catherine Parr, Henry's last queen. Her story didn't end with Henry's death. When she was free, she married Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved for years. But fate wasn't going to grant her happiness for long. In her new marriage, she became pregnant, but complications during childbirth led to her death. In 1548, she passed away from a fever caused by childbirth. The strong, wise queen of the Tudor court had escaped Henry, but couldn't escape life. And so, my friend, of Henry VIII's 6 wives, only one gave him a male heir, but that heir died young. The Tudor dynasty couldn't continue as Henry had hoped, and in the end, the most unexpected person, Henry's daughter Elizabeth, became one of England's greatest rulers. History is full of ironies. Henry married 6 times for a male heir, but in the end the throne passed into the hands of a woman. And that woman, Elizabeth I, would write the Tudor dynasty's name in golden letters in history. But that's another story. Now, my friend, let's rest for a while, because history grows as it's told, and there's much more to be told. Ah, my friend, a king's 6 marriages aren't just a story that sparks palace gossip. No, Henry VIII's marriages were a turning point that changed the fate of England. His loves, passions, feelings of betrayal, and obsessions didn't just shape the lives of his wives, they shaped the future of an entire nation. If Henry hadn't been on a quest for a male heir, if his passion for Anne Boleyn hadn't pushed him to challenge the Catholic Church, England could have been an entirely different country today. These marriages didn't just ensure the continuation of the Tudor dynasty, they also made the Protestant Reformation permanent, determined England's place in Europe, and left behind a legacy that would last for centuries. The changes Henry set in motion with his marriages went far beyond just trying to win a woman's heart. His battle against the Catholic Church plunged England into a profound transformation. By rejecting Rome's authority and creating the Church of England, he forever altered the country's religious identity. But Henry's reformation was just the beginning. His son, Edward VI, strengthened Protestantism even more. Then, when the throne passed to Henry's eldest daughter, Catholic Mary I, there was a brief but bloody reversal. Ah, poor Mary. She tried to undo her father's Protestant reforms, but in doing so, she spilled the blood of thousands. And finally, Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, took the throne. She was the one who truly shaped England's future. Elizabeth inherited her father's legacy, but ruled with much more wisdom. By balancing the Catholic and Protestant tensions, she solidified the country's religious identity for good. If Henry hadn't divorced Catherine of Aragon, if he hadn't married Anne Boleyn, if the Church of England hadn't been created, England today might still be a Catholic nation. But history wasn't written that way. Henry's desires and obsessions sealed England's fate forever. Look at who sat on Henry's throne, my friend. Each of them was a result of his marriages. First his son Edward VI, then Catholic Mary, and after that the glorious Elizabeth I. His marriages weren't just short love stories. They were political chess moves that determined the future of England. And these women, Henry's queens, were more than just wives. They were figures who determined England's fate. Anne Boleyn was the woman who convinced Henry to break from the church. Jane Seymour gave him his greatest desire, a male heir. Catherine Parr was a wise wife who comforted Henry in his final years and raised his children. Henry thought he chose them, but maybe fate brought them into his life to shape England. When Henry's throne passed to his daughter Elizabeth, England was a completely different country. It had shed its old Catholic beliefs, strengthened its Protestant identity, and was on its way to becoming one of Europe's greatest maritime powers. Henry's wars had ripples that echoed as loudly as his tumultuous love life, but perhaps his greatest legacy was the queens he left behind and their children. Without them, England might have remained a vassal of Spain, France, or Rome. But now, England was about to transform into a mighty empire fueled by the Tudor legacy. And so, my friend, Henry VIII's 6 marriages weren't just a king's love story. These marriages shaped the destiny of a nation. Henry's loves and passions didn't just change the lives of his wives, they changed the history of an entire nation. Now, my friend, take a moment to pause and think. Is history just about wars? Or is it sometimes the desires growing in a man's heart that changes the course of a nation? I leave the answer to you, but remember, history lives on as it's told, and every time Henry VIII's story is told, it grows just a little bit more. The stories never end here, but for now, it's time to say goodbye.